All right, so Pavlovian conditioning obviously gets its name from Ivan Pavlov, who was one of the first to describe it. I wouldn't necessarily say invented it, but rather sort of described and sort of adequately put into terms sort of what was going on. Probably you guys have heard of Pavlovian conditioning before. Perhaps it rings a bell, which is my best joke of the day, but also hopefully you'll find out later it's probably not even really a good joke for a variety of reasons. But one of the sort of, I think, common conceptions of Pavlovian conditioning or classical conditioning, or where it comes from, is that it was sort of originally derived as sort of from a psychological perspective or a way to train dogs, or that we have Pavlovian conditioning or classical conditioning as a way to train our dogs. But Pavlovian conditioning has been around. It's pretty much in every species that you can name or mention. We can be easily Pavlovian conditioning. It is constantly going on. And while it could be used as a training method or mechanism, it's not just for training. It is for understanding why we do the things that we do, why our dogs do the things that they do. Whether you mean to or not, Pavlovian conditioning or classical conditioning is going on all of the time. And really what happened is that Pavlov was not out to understand sort of the salivation of dogs when you ring different bells. In fact, he never actually used a bell, but rather his sort of goal was for studying physiology and digestion. So that's why he was studying salivation in the dog, not because it just seemed like a convenient thing to do for understanding behavior. It's because it was not even focused on that particular type of topic at the time, but rather found that these dogs started to engage in sort of salivation responses as almost a form of what was called psychic secretions, or essentially before they even got the food. And it just sort of became a bit of a curiosity. Why were the dogs engaging in this sort of salivation response before they even got food? What was the biological relevance or sort of function to that? And basically what found is that dogs will, as you can imagine, when you give them food repeatedly, over and over again, they start to salivate, but they will start to anticipate when it is that you are going to give them the food. And they will actually start to engage in a response before you even gave them the food, because they have come to anticipate this. And this is what Pavlov started to study, was how did the dogs come to anticipate this? And started to use sort of clearer or more obvious and controllable stimuli rather than just simply whatever happens to be around or what is the dog actually sensing. And that was largely a metronome. So first, let's get into some terminology. So one of our learning objectives is to hopefully be able to use these different words appropriately. The first is the unconditioned stimulus, a stimulus that produces a response prior to training. Another is the unconditioned response, or a response to the unconditioned stimulus prior to training. So we just talked about phylogenetic reflexes, and that's what this is. So typically you'll have some type of phylogenetic reflex, like light and contraction of your pupil, or some type of air puff and blink of the eye. So this would be an unconditioned stimulus, would be that stimulus that triggers this reflexive response. So in this example of light causing a contraction of the pupil, would be the unconditioned stimulus, would be the light itself. So the light is the stimulus that is then causing this unconditioned response, or this reflexive response, to contract the pupil, or the air puff that leads to the blink. So this is that reflex stimulus response. And we say unconditioned, meaning that you essentially did not have to learn this. You essentially came pre-prepared to engage in this response. It was unconditioned, or not, or basically not requiring any type of learning at that particular time. Then you have the conditioned stimulus. So this is going to be a stimulus that is normally starts off initially neutral, and typically we call it the neutral stimulus then. And this is what gets subsequently paired or conditioned through repeated associations with the unconditioned stimulus. And the conditioned response is a response to the conditioned stimulus that develops after repeated associations between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus being presented and being repeatedly paired. So we can get into a lot more sort of complications within this, but I'm not going to for these purposes. But if this becomes something of interest, and I'll give you some different references later, you can go into sort of a wide variety of different permutations of exactly what types of associations are occurring and how they are occurring. But we'll go over sort of some of the classic examples here first. So food leading to salivation, which was sort of the original kind of Pavlovian conditioned response, that the dog sees food or the dog receives food, they have an unconditioned response of salivation. And what we mean by this is that this is the initial reflexive response. They didn't need any particular type of learning or experience, that when food is put into your mouth, you begin to salivate to start the digestive process. And this is why Pavlov was involved in this to begin with. It's because he was studying digestion, not just because salivation is a particularly interesting behavior of the dog. So our unconditioned stimulus, or the stimulus that triggers that response, is going to be the food. And then that unconditioned or that unlearned biologically reflexive response is the salivation here. So now initially, a little bit before you present the food, you can present a metronome. So in this case, when you first present a metronome, you don't get any particular salivation. So this is what we call initially the neutral stimulus, or what is to become the conditioned stimulus. So as you can imagine, you can take a metronome, put it in front of a baby, put it in front of a puppy, they're not going to start salivating. However, if through conditioning, you start the metronome a few seconds before the food is delivered to the mouth, after repeated associations of this, the metronome alone will come to elicit salivation, or the conditioned responding here. So here, after conditioning, the metronome is our conditioned stimulus because it is what the animal or individual has learned as a stimulus to release the unconditioned or conditioned response in this case, which is salivation. In this particular situation, the salivation is both the unconditioned response and the conditioned response. This is not necessarily always the case. A lot of times they will be the same type of response, but several times they will be different responses. And I'll give examples to that towards the very end of this module. But for right now, it's sufficient to understand that the CS is sort of eliciting a conditioned response of salivation, which is the same response that is elicited by the unconditioned stimulus itself. That just happens in this case. That is not necessarily always the case. So here, hopefully you can be able to give an example of an unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, and a conditioned stimulus and conditioned response to a different type of training paradigm, or at least be able to define each one of these terms and how they are used here. A simple example that you might use in dog training is going to be every time you say good boy, or yes, or free, or congratulations, whatever it is that you particularly use, you might say something like good boy, good girl, good dog, whatever that happens to be. This becomes a conditioned stimulus because it ends up getting repeatedly paired or associated with the unconditioned stimulus of whatever that sort of reinforcer reward will be. In this case, could be food, but it could very easily be a toy. And then what you would get is some type of conditioned response, like some type of food or preparatory behaviors, or some type of conditioned reinforcing type of response. So you can use food in this case, or it very well could be a toy or something like that. But what you're getting is repeated association between whatever stimulus comes before and the unconditioned stimulus. So this is a great example of sort of purposeful Pavlovian conditioning, and a good example of perhaps even using something like clicker training, where you can use a click followed by food or a toy or some other type of unconditioned stimulus that eventually just the click alone or just a good dog alone will turn or create some type of behavior. If you've been working with your detection dog a lot, you might notice that if you have some type of clear stimulus that ends up being associated with whenever the dog makes a correct alert, they will show a very clear response to that. Sometimes that can be something as great as, a good job, or yes, or correct, or in a lot of our cases, or a lot of our research, is just simply a computerized tone. Or it could be something unintentional. It could be reaching into your back pocket. It could be leaning over the dog. It could be reaching towards the dog. It could be as simple as I start to slow the pace of my walk. All of these things can come into association with the delivery of food or toy, which would lead to changes of the dog's behavioral response. These are all examples or situations of this that you can create intentionally or unintentionally some type of stimulus coming into association with the delivery of your unconditioned stimulus. In many cases, it'll be food or toys, leading to a particular conditioned response whenever that conditioned stimulus appears. And the simplest example, it could be a good boy or a click, leading to the dog to turn and engage in some type of food preparatory behaviors to wherever that sound came from. Okay, and now we're going to dive into some classical conditioning phenomena, and I'll go ahead and give you guys another little quick break.